Hey! Welcome to today's beginner to intermediate friendly watercolor tutorial. We are going to be painting this beautiful coral charm peony together. Let's take a moment before we start painting to have a look at a gorgeous coral charm peony. This is one of my absolute favorite flowers, and what you notice is there are these 5 pieces in the middle. I believe they're called stigma, and the petals are almost a saucer shape. That's what I was trying to show with my hand. If you take your hand and you straighten it and just curl in the tips of your fingers, you have that incredible shape. So, having those little intricacies in mind, let us start a sketch together. Right now, you see what I'm doing real time so that you can really follow along and understand how much or how little pressure I'm using with this pencil. I go super lightly because it is quite challenging to erase a lot on watercolor paper, and I don't want too much of it showing through at the end because once you apply color, it gets locked in. But anyway, back to the sketch. The first step is to sketch the coral charm peony onto our watercolor paper. Really embrace the organic nature of the flower and let your pencil flow freely. If you can, add little pieces like I did at the bottom here that are where the little petals would curve up, and they add a really tiny element, an idea of 3D to the sketch. You also want to really pay attention, I'm going to show you right here, to the fact that at the bottom of the petals, when they curve up, they are almost straight, not a straight line, but consistent. And at the top of the edges of each of the petal that's pointing inwards towards the flower, they are much more irregular and soft and imperfect. If you learn to notice those kind of intricacies of whatever you are sketching, you're going to be able to naturally add a really organic, realistic, inspired feel to your sketch. Now, of course, you do not have to replicate my sketch one-to-one. You don't have to replicate what you're seeing if you have a peony right next to you in real life. This is just to help you get the general feel for the shapes. I like to start at the outside and work inwards, but that is not a requirement. That just helps me really fill the space and understand how these petals are layered. So that's my personal preference. And the more you sketch, the more you will realize how you prefer to draw. By the way, this is a watercolor painting tutorial, and I think the sketch is so important, but I do not teach drawing as such. So you have options. You can pause the video when I am done with a sketch and try to freehand that same sketch onto your paper. You can follow along, you can change the speed of the video if you need it to be slowed down from this time lapse, and do kind of a, one by one, follow every single pencil stroke that I'm doing. If you're not super into drawing yet and you don't feel like practicing at this very moment, I also have a link in the description below where you can download this sketch, and I tell you how to transfer that onto watercolor paper. Now let us take our masking fluid to preserve the white space in the center of our peony. This technique is going to really just make our life easier when we get to painting that middle. And by the way, I'm using the cap here because it was plugged and I didn't have a needle or anything to actually open it up. So if you have a fine applicator tip, then please apply that because you will be able to apply the masking fluid way more delicately and just have an even more beautiful result than I'm going to. Now, while we wait for the masking fluid to dry, it can be a while, let us start mixing our colors. To keep this tutorial simple, we are only going to use 2 brushes in total, and we're going to do the entire color, all the petals and the center, with only 2 colors. So we're going to start here with a number 6 brush, and we're going to use lots of water and our 2 colors of choice, which are cadmium free yellow and what is this one called? Rose madder. Ooh. And yeah, just take tons of water and a tiny, tiny bit of pigment. You're seeing me do this here. Now, you really want to start infusing the peony with gentle hues. So create these light washes of pink and yellow, which is just going to capture that essence of the coral charm variety. Now, remember, watercolor painting is all about finding the right balance between water and pigment. So experiment with different ratios and know that as we go along in these steps, we are usually going to work from the lightest to the most saturated. So you're seeing I'm just dipping it in with the tippy, tippy, tippy tip of that brush, taking the tiniest bit of pigment and ending up with these mixes. I mixed a few different colors because you can see, look at this peony, it has so many different tints. That is one of the things that is so typical of the coral charm variety and gives it all its dun 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 charm. Yeah, okay, I know that was a little stupid, but it is gorgeous, no? Okay, focus. What are we going to do next? We are taking some of that wash, specifically the one that you have created that has a little more of a yellow hue to it. So not one of the pinks to start with. Take one that's a tiny bit more yellow with a hint of orange and start really lightly applying it. You're going to start in the very center. Don't worry, you can completely go over your masking fluid as long as it has already dried. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a huge mess, so definitely don't do that. But yeah, once it's dried, you can apply it straight over, and it's still going to preserve those white spaces in the middle. And then just repeat the process along with me here. You're going to add it not to every single petal, but to quite a few. And you're going to add that yellowish color at the base of each of the petals. And you can see here what I mean with the base. The base is always the side that is pointing closer towards the center of the flower. And then while that paint is still wet, that light wash, you are going to wash your brush and pick up some of the wash that is more of a, well, I guess it's coral, but to me it's almost like a salmon color. And you are going to apply that, letting that flow into the area. So basically applying at the top of the petals, mixing it in with the yellow that is at the bottom of that petal. And you can see here, I'm doing this pretty lightly. I'm just dabbing. You do not want to flood your paper. Water control is so key as you learn to use watercolor. So just be careful. You can always add more. You can always add another layer or dip your pen in more your brush in more water. But once it's applied, it's going to be a lot more difficult to clean up the mess, to control the color, and also it might warp your paper. So definitely a skill that you want to practice and practice until you get really good at that. So we can slowly continue. At this stage, we are working in a technique that is called wet on wet. So it is fine if the colors are merging. You do not have to wait for all of this to dry at this very point. I'm taking another color that is again a pinkish wash and continuing the same kind of process. I like to mix different colors just because I think it gives it much more interesting visual variety than doing every single petal the very same way. But you do want to apply that same color across petals. So kind of go in a circle, apply it here or there, skip a petal in between so that the color picks up on each other and it's not completely chaotic with 100 colors and nothing looking the same. So now I'm adding some of that pigment. It's still a light wash, but it is getting a tiny bit darker, if you can tell here. And I'm adding it to the edges. The way, if you are still a beginner in watercolor, this is the perfect tutorial to do a few times, really, because what we're doing right now is great practice in finding the right balance between water and pigment. You know, different ratios are going to create different translucency. And let me finish that thought here in 1 second and describe what we're doing first. Let's take our size 000 or 1 millimeter tiny brush and take a little bit more saturation onto it. So you're going to want to mix another pink or use one that you already have on your palette that is in the same color family. So use that same pink and yellow and mix a tiny bit more saturation into it. So just a little less water, a little more pigment. And take a tiny bit onto your brush and then go over, as I'm doing here, use it almost as if it were a pencil and go over some of the edges and add some, if you want, lines like I'm doing here, really fine lines into the petals as well. Not into every single one unless you want to, based on a stylistic choice, but I like to just do it here and there, and it really reinforces that shape of each petal, that roundness. So honestly, you know, just everyone is an artist, so give it your own flavor. And if you experiment and it goes wrong, you can just always start over again, take it as a learning lesson, or maybe it is going to be a wonderful, happy accident. Just follow your gut and your heart, take risks in your painting process, and you're going to learn so much. So, as these different layers dry, and we have that base gentle hue that we've already put, we gradually build up layers of color. Again, we're working from lightest to darkest, emphasizing areas where petals meet or overlap, just to make sure there's delineation. You can see where one petal starts and another one ends. And also because realistically, that is going to be where there is going to be more darkness, because, you know, the light can't hit in those in-between parts of the petals. And so naturally, it's just going to be a tiny shade darker there. Now, don't be afraid to embrace the unpredictable nature and beauty of watercolor. So what I love is playing with, let's say, just different ways of applying. So sometimes you see me take a bunch right now. Hey, you know what? I'm going to make something that's a little more orange, just slightly. Because remember, we're not using super deep shades right now. These are all relatively light. And sometimes I take a little more water, sometimes I take a little more color, and then I often use my brush, just dip it right back into water afterwards and move those colors around. And my goal in the end is to have countless layers on each petal and to never go over in the same shape twice. So I want the effect to be that there are tons and tons of layers underneath, and they partially overlap, but I'm not doing these perfect shapes that are all the exact same, and that allows to have some lightness, some natural highlights. It all happens automatically when you follow this technique. Playing with these different layers that way really allows the beauty of watercolor to shine through. You have uneven layers, you have these glimpses of the underlying washes shining through. It's creating texture, and I just think it is absolutely gorgeous, and it's kind of perfectly imperfect. And does that mean I love every single thing I create? No, absolutely not. There are favorites, and sometimes I think, oh my goodness, how did I create this? And then maybe the next day I sit down and oof, I'm really not pleased with my final result. And really, I didn't do much different, but that is what you got to do. You just got to practice and accept that not every single painting is going to be a home run, but you are building skill as you go. And I always like to think too, hey, what did I learn? Like, especially if I kind of look back at the final results, I sometimes think, oh yeah, I really shouldn't have done that. That's where I took a wrong turn. I learned from it. And I also tried to find, even if it's just a tiny inch or centimeter of the painting that I love, because I think it's never a total loss. There's always something that really worked out well. And hold on to those moments and build your skill. So continue here along with me. Layer by layer, we're doing the same kind of thing. I always have that more saturated color originating from the corners of the petal or the outer rim. And it usually goes into both directions, so the top and the bottom of the petal. I don't know if you meditate, but I honestly don't. Many people tell me I should, but I have not been able to bring myself to do that. But what I am able to do is sit down and paint. And that is my form of meditation, because with this watercolor, I really embrace getting into the flow state of things, because it is such a joyful experience. And you have to have a lot of patience and be fully focused. You need to make sure that each part is dry when you're using this wet on dry technique that I usually use, except for that base layer where we're using wet on wet, and really adding the most delicate, wispy little pieces, working on that magical layering, seeing it all come together and seeing the beauty that you create on your page. To me, that is my form of meditation. So I don't know. How do you feel about painting? I hope it's this Zen kind of experience for you and not something that really stresses you out or frustrates you, even though, of course, we all have our days like that too. Kind of a pro tip for me though, at least for me, if a day is just off, sometimes I just stop, because there are days where I cannot create a good painting, and it doesn't mean I don't have any skill, or it's just the day is off with painting and there's absolutely no point investing hours and hours, because it's just not going to result in anything beautiful. And I have come to accept those days and not think that I need to paint every single day, for example, right? These like 100-day challenges. And anyway, let me interrupt my little monologue here to tell you about the next step if you are following along, which is to remove the masking tape. It's time. Masking tape. Why do I always say that? Masking fluid. So let's take a really delicate wash of a yellow with a tiny bit of a hint of orange, which you can get by mixing your two colors. You can also start adding a few really fine, almost hairline thickness lines there. And let's call these little bow tie shapes in the middle. By the way, I feel like I have a few open thoughts here that I need to loop back to for you. So the first one that we just talked about for sure was the whole idea of like a 100-day challenge or having to create art every single day. And I do not believe in that. I think if that is your personality and you can make that work with your life, you want to prioritize, you love it, then do it. But for me, I can't do it every day. And even every time I try to paint, it doesn't always go well, and I just have to stop because it's a waste of my time to keep going, investing hours into something that's just not working out. So that's my personal philosophy. I know there's different thoughts, but yeah, what do you think? Let me know in the comment how you feel about that controversial take and topic. Anyway, yeah, so you may have just noticed that my camera did unfortunately die. The battery died. And so I provided something you can go back and pause on, which is basically a summary of the steps of what I did to get the painting to that point where my camera was able to pick back up. So go back to that if you didn't catch it. And now we are adding a little more saturation into the middle with basically the most vibrant pink that you have straight out of the tube or the pan, and then that delicate orange that you mix with the yellow and the pink to add some detail and definition to the middle. Now, I recorded and edited this voiceover quite a few times, so I'm not quite sure if I mentioned it. Trying to close the loop, but I have to describe what's happening here. Okay, so let us do this step together as well, which honestly I did completely freestyle, freehand. And the reason was that I was not happy with the composition on the page where I had placed the sketch, and I felt like it needed some leaves and a stem and everything to balance things out. So what color did I use for that? For my color, I used chromium green oxide, which was an okay choice. I selected it mostly because I wanted to make sure we can do this with 3 colors. So it probably would look better if you mixed some greens, picked a different one, lots of variety, but we're keeping it simple for the stems and the leaves, starting with a really light wash and slowly building up color, but we're doing it way more freely and fast than the delicate petals of the flower. By the way, let's really get to this final thought. I'm going to squeeze it in here for you. Okay, so again, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but I want to finish the point or make the point. And that is that when we started that very first step of having those super light washes, if you wanted, you could theoretically continue like that and barely add any more saturation. And you could redo this exact tutorial like 5 different times, because I don't know if you have ever seen a coral charm peony, but the super cool thing about them is that they change their colors in a way that is just absolutely unbelievable. So from day 1, when it's just opening, to like 3 days later, you're going to go from a super vibrant pink to an almost, it's like it's barely there. It's cream colored. And in between, the stages are so stunning. So yeah, we ended up doing more of a pink one here, but while I'm recording this voiceover 2 days later, it's almost as white as a wall. So you could use this tutorial, try different washes, saturations, try out that, really practice how much pigment you're using and what water you're using and what it is creating on the page. Learn to control that color, and you can do it again and again and always end up with a coral charm peony. You could even then digitally assemble them into like a bouquet of peonies that have, basically just different stages. So let me know what you think of the tutorial. We are done. I would love to see yours. So please tag me on social media and check out this playlist here, because there are lots more water tutorials for you if you enjoyed this one.